The sun was low over the Piedmont hills, casting long shadows across the concrete floor of a small winery. A man in stained overalls wrestled the cap from a heavy metal drum, its label faded, but the skull and crossbones symbol still visible. He tipped the container, and a stream of clear, odorless liquid splashed into an open vat where purple grapes were already fermenting. This was not a secret family recipe. It was industrial methanol, a solvent distilled not for drinking, but for antifreeze and paint stripper. His hands moved with practiced haste, measuring nothing, guided only by the crude goal of boosting the alcohol percentage. The methanol mixed seamlessly with the wine, invisible to the eye and nearly undetectable to the palate in small amounts. For the winemaker, it was a simple calculation. This drum cost a fraction of what proper fermentation or adding distilled grape spirits would require. Each litre he poured promised higher profits from the cheap table wine destined for local markets and unsuspecting families. He sealed the vat, wiped his hands on a rag, and moved on to the next task. The methanol now lay trapped within thousands of litres of dark red wine, a toxic secret suspended in the vintage. In that moment, the chemical became something far more dangerous. An adulterant, not a solvent. Its journey from factory drum to dinner glass had begun, carrying with it a poison that the human body could not process, but would instead transform into a weapon against itself. The toxic practice didn't stop at the Italian border. By the early 1980s, the same fraudulent technique had seeped into Austrian warehouses. There, a worker would lower a simple glass hydrometer into a vat of thin young wine, watching the floating scale bob in the pale liquid. The reading was always too low. His solution waited in a plastic jerry can nearby. He unscrewed the cap, releasing the sharp, solvent scent of pure methanol. With no protective gloves, he tipped the jerry can, and a stream of the clear, volatile liquid glugged into the wine vat. He stirred with a long wooden paddle, the liquids swirling together. His only goal was to hit a target number on the hydrometer, a figure that meant higher profits for his employer. He had no chart, no training on the poison's lethal threshold. A few extra litres seemed harmless, just another industrial chemical to boost the strength. He sealed the vat, unaware that the dose he'd just added could, in a single bottle, begin destroying the optic nerves of whoever drank it, starting a silent countdown to blindness or death. The toxic wine had already crossed borders, and now its first victims began arriving at hospitals. In Turin, one man stumbled through the emergency room doors, his body convulsing with violent retching. Between heaves, he gasped about a splitting headache and a world that had grown blurry and indistinct. The attending physician shone a penlight into his eyes. The pupils remained wide, black pools that refused to constrict. This fixed, dilated gaze was a textbook red flag. The doctors moved quickly, drawing blood for analysis while starting an intravenous drip. They knew that behind those unresponsive pupils, a poison was at work, one that specifically targeted the optic nerve. The man was transferred to a quieter room, his vision continuing to darken as medical staff prepared for a race against a metabolic clock. The clinical suspicion was methanol poisoning, but the source was still a mystery. The patient, now stabilized, recounted drinking a cheap local wine with friends the previous evening. It was a common, unremarkable bottle with no label to trace. For the doctors, the puzzle pieces locked into place. The symptoms, the timing, and now the probable vehicle. A single bottle of wine had become a delivery system for blindness. The single case in Turin was not an anomaly. Within weeks, emergency rooms from Milan to Vienna began admitting patients with the same terrifying symptoms: violent nausea, splitting headaches, and pupils that remained wide and fixed even under bright lights. Doctors, initially baffled by the pattern, compared notes. They realized they were facing not isolated incidents, but a spreading epidemic of poisoning. Health officials launched a frantic investigation, interviewing victims and their families. A common thread emerged from the confusion. Each person had consumed cheap, unbranded wine. The bottles, often sold without labels in local markets or poured from unmarked casks in taverns, had been a bargain. Now they were the only clue pointing to a source that was poisoning entire communities. Tracing those bottles became a race against time. Inspectors fanned out, collecting samples from shops and warehouses. They mapped the purchases, and the trail began to converge. It led back to specific batches of wine, all originating from a handful of producers in northern Italy and Austria. The poison had a brand, and authorities now knew exactly what they were hunting. As the hospital reports piled up, toxicologists in white lab coats gathered around a bench cluttered with glassware. They needed to understand why this particular poison stole sight. They knew the liver was the first stop. An enzyme there seized the methanol molecules and began a deadly transformation, converting them into a far more toxic substance, formaldehyde. But the process didn't stop there. Another enzyme quickly attacked the formaldehyde, changing it once more. The final product was formic acid. In a healthy body, this acid is processed and expelled. But with a massive methanol dose, the system became overwhelmed. The acid began to pool in the bloodstream, a corrosive tide that disrupted the body's fundamental chemistry. This acidification, called metabolic acidosis, starved cells of oxygen, yet the acid sought specific targets. It crossed into the fluid of the eye and accumulated around the retina and the optic nerve. There, it directly attacked the delicate photoreceptor cells and the nerve fibers that carry visual signals to the brain. This assault was not reversible. Once those pathways were severed, the connection to light was lost forever. The trail from hospital wards led directly to warehouses and bottling lines. Armed with search warrants, squads of carabinieri and food safety inspectors descended on suspect wineries at dawn. They kicked open warehouse doors to reveal rows of steel vats, their contents now evidence in a mass poisoning case. The air inside was thick with the sweet fermented smell of wine and something sharper, chemical. In cramped office rooms, officers flipped through damp, stained ledgers. Their fingers traced line after line of bulk purchases, not of grapes or yeast, but of industrial methanol solvent. The invoices listed quantities by the hundreds of litres bought from chemical suppliers, not vineyards. Each entry was a financial motive made horrifyingly physical, a paper trail that connected cheap poison to the dinner tables of Europe. Outside, under the glare of television lights, the final act of the seizure unfolded. Inspectors, wearing heavy rubber gloves, connected hoses to the confiscated storage tanks. A deep crimson river gushed from the pipes, flooding the gutters. Thousands of litres of the adulterated wine swirled down the drains, a public spectacle of destruction meant to purge the poison from the market and signal the end of impunity. News of the raids and confiscations spread faster than the poison itself. Within days, the panic that had gripped hospitals now seized dining rooms and wine cellars across the continent. In Parisian bistros, waiters watched as customers pushed aside carafes of house red. In German supermarkets, shoppers hesitated before entire shelves of Italian and Austrian labels, their hands hovering, then withdrawing. The collapse was visceral and immediate. Wine merchants reported sales plummeting by half. In Bordeaux and Burgundy, producers who had nothing to do with the scandal found their own exports stalling, tarred by the same brush of suspicion. Desperate vineyard owners from Tuscany to the Wachau Valley nailed hand-painted signs to their gates and shop windows, Vino Sicuro and Cane Methanol, desperate declarations of innocence in a market now defined by fear. That fear flowed from bottles into kitchen sinks. Families who had stockpiled cheap wine for daily meals now poured it down drains, the purple liquid swirling away as a tangible act of distrust. The scandal was no longer just a criminal act or a medical crisis. It had become a cultural rupture, severing a centuries-old bond of trust between European consumers and one of their most fundamental staples. The courtrooms of Milan and Vienna fell silent as prosecutors unsealed their evidence. They laid out crisp, damning invoices on wooden benches, paper trails documenting bulk purchases of industrial methanol from chemical suppliers. Beside them sat falsified laboratory reports, their margins stamped with the signatures of complicit chemists who had certified the poisoned wine as safe for human consumption. One by one, winemakers and merchants took the stand, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. Prosecutors held up ledger entries showing methanol deliveries timed perfectly with wine shipments. They presented testimony from warehouse workers who described watching clear solvent being pumped directly into blending vats, all to cheat a simple hydrometer test for alcohol content. The gavels fell. Several defendants received prison sentences for manslaughter and fraud, their operations dismantled. The verdicts did not bring back the dead nor restore lost sight, but they established a legal precedent. Adulterating food was no longer mere fraud. It was an act of criminal negligence with lethal consequences. As the courtroom doors closed on the convicted merchants, a different kind of machinery began to whir in Brussels. The European community, its credibility shaken, drafted regulations with teeth. Paperwork alone would no longer suffice. The new rules demanded a physical chain of custody, a documented journey for every grape from soil to shelf that inspectors could follow like a trail of breadcrumbs. The real change arrived not with ledgers, but with laboratory glassware. Government inspectors now arrived unannounced at bottling plants, their tool a humming gas chromatograph. They would draw a sample, inject it into the machine, and wait as it separated the wine's molecular signature, hunting for the distinct spike that betrayed even trace amounts of methanol hiding among the ethanol. This new regime of enforced transparency transformed the cellar. Every transaction, every transfer of bulk wine between cooperatives required a signed certificate of analysis. A bottle's label became the endpoint of a verifiable history, its contents guaranteed not by trust, but by a system of checks designed to make fraud not just illegal, but mechanically impossible to conceal. The courtroom verdicts had been delivered, the new regulations printed in official journals, but in a small town square in northern Italy, the human cost remained. A simple stone plaque, cool to the touch, was set into a wall. Sunlight caught the engraved names, one after another, a silent roster of the men and women who had bought a bottle of cheap wine and never came home. The plaque became a focal point for families on anniversaries where they left flowers that wilted in the sun. For the winemakers who passed it, the names were a permanent rebuke, a physical reminder that their industry's pursuit of profit had once bypassed the most fundamental duty of care. The scandal had shattered trust, and rebuilding it required more than just new laws. That duty was now codified in every cellar and bottling plant. Before any wine could be sealed, a sample was drawn and analyzed. The technician watched a chromatograph's needle trace a precise line across graph paper, its peak confirming the absence of methanol. This test, born from tragedy, became the non-negotiable final gatekeeper for every bottle destined for a European table.